In this technical tutorial, you'll learn how the BlendIf features work in Photoshop, as well as how Lumenzia uses them in order to create the equivalent of luminosity masks using BlendIf. This has a couple of major advantages for your work. First, no increase in file size, unlike a layer mask, which increases the size of your file significantly. And second, the results are dynamic. If you make changes to the underlying layers, the mask is always up to date. You don't have to rebuild it. So let's jump in and see how this works. For this demonstration, I've created a gradient and then a red solid fill on top, rather than using a photograph, because I think the points will be much more clear in this lesson by working with these just very simple ideas, and you can extrapolate them to how you work with your photographs. So let's say in this example that I wanted to apply whatever's on this layer to the highlights below. So I want to apply this red to the highlights of the underlying layer. To do this as a BlendIf in Lumenzia, I need to change the blending mode. CS6 users will access this by using keyboard shortcuts. Specifically, the Shift key will give you BlendIf, and holding Shift plus the Command or Control key will give you a BlendIf under mode. CC users, you'll use this row of buttons up top for the new modes in Lumenzia version 3.0. Click on it twice to get to If Under. This is the BlendIf Under mode. You'll see the tooltip dynamically changes on the modal button here to tell you what you're doing. And you can see all of the mask creation buttons below in blue are matching it, letting you know that these are all available for creating BlendIf. That's all the standard masks, all the zone masks, the zone pickers, and the range picker can all be used to create a BlendIf. You can also use them in an inverted mode by clicking on Not, which will give you the opposite result. For example, a Not Lights 5 will protect Lights 5 instead of selecting it and select everything else to invert it. So this is a great way to protect parts of the image. So let's go ahead and start creating a few masks and get a feel for things. So I'm going to create a BlendIf Under because I want to look at the underlying gradient. There's no real information in this top layer, it's just solid red, but underneath is where all my highlights and shadows are. So if I click on Zone 2, I have already masked this red layer to the areas that are Zone 2 in the underlying layers in this gradient. And I can move through by just simply clicking on the different options to see where this is applied. And again, all these are available. So I can look at all lights, lights 2, lights 3, lights 5, etc. on down the chain to quickly move through and see which one is applied. Now, let's take a look at an example where maybe it won't be quite as obvious. If I was working in the darker ranges here, just applying this normally, I can see the red. It's very obvious, but there are a lot of cases where a photograph may not be as obvious. One might be, let's say we were in the multiply blend mode in this case here, and obviously if I look at something like Zone D, it's very obvious where that's applied because the underlying pixels are bright enough that the multiply leaves me with something to look at. But if I look at, for example, Zone A, I can't really tell, is this blended but black, or is it not blended? If you want to see this, click on the If Visualization button at the bottom of the panel. Clicking on it will create a temporary green appearance showing you exactly where the BlendIf is being applied. This is the BlendIf equivalent of looking at the layer mask to help you visualize exactly where the BlendIf is being applied. It's also dynamic, so as I click through with the BlendIf Under, I can see exactly where this is applied. It's not dynamic if I'm in the BlendIf This mode, but I'll show you how to deal with that in a little bit. When you're done with the visualization, click the If button again, and it is removed. So let's go back to our normal blend mode here, and let's take a look at what Lumenzia is doing. First, I'm going to clear this BlendIf, and I can do that by clicking on the X key, which will ask me if I want to remove the BlendIf, and I'll say yes. I'm going to undo that for a second and just point out that if you hold down the Shift key and click on X, it gets removed automatically without bothering you with a pop-up. So that's a quick way to work, but the X key will always help you get rid of the BlendIf if you don't need it. So let's take a look at how BlendIf works in Photoshop for a second. So double click anywhere to the right of the name. If you click on the name, it'll rename it. Click to the right, and you'll get this BlendIf dialog in the bottom here saying BlendIf Gray, looking at this layer and underlying layer. These are filters. And the logic here is if this layer meets these conditions, then it can show. And if the underlying layer meets these conditions, then the layer can show. If either of these is not true, then the layer is not blended. So for example, in the underlying image, if I start excluding dark tones, then I can see that the layer is not being blended. Similarly, I can bring down the white tones and we can see that that is not being blended. So the general logic here is exclude anything left of the black slider, include everything in between these sliders, and then exclude everything to the right of the white slider. That's the general logic. Now there is one case where things can get a little tricky, and that is you can actually move the white and black past each other. And the way to think about that is everything right of the black slider until it hits the left of the white is going to be selected. So right now it's everything to the right until the left of the white. But if I move it here, it's everything right of the black. Oh, it hit the end all the way back to the beginning. Keep going until we get to the white slider and end. This is helpful to create inverted masks, those knot masks. Don't worry about it too much. It can really be a little bit of a head blender. I just want you to be aware that it is possible to flip the masks like that. Now the other thing to know about this is we can split the sliders. If I hold down the Alt or Option key, I can then drag these apart. And notice that before the edge of this mask was very hard, I'm sorry, I actually need to split that, and now it's much softer. And so the way to think about this is everything's excluded to the left of the first part of the black, then there's a transition zone, everything's selected in the middle, then there's another transition zone, and then everything is blocked. So that is the general logic of how the BlendIf works. Let's jump out of here and take a look at a few concrete examples of how Lumenzia is working. If we click on the BlendIf under lights 5, we're going to get this, which is exclude all the really dark stuff and then create this transition zone until we're fully selected at white. That's kind of the general idea. This is going to be a very close match to a lights 5, but I do want to point out that it's not exactly the same. If we, for example, let's go ahead and cancel this for a second and take a look at what a regular luminosity mask would look like. So I'm going to click back to the normal mode, going to look at lights 5, and it's important to make sure you turn off this layer because we wanted to look at BlendIf under. So this is the equivalent of a BlendIf under. And if we look at the curve in Lumenzia, notice the shape of this curve has a lot of complexity to it. BlendIf is not nearly so sophisticated. So BlendIf is actually giving you this curve. It's a straight line, whereas our curve in before looked something more like this, where it had a little bit of a curve to it. So the difference between those is pretty minor, and one is not necessarily more correct than the other, but you should be aware that the two approaches don't give you exactly the same results. Now in general, for the darks, for the lights, and for the center midtones, including everything from zone B through D and zone 3 through 7, the match is very, very accurate. But for the brightest midtones and the darkest midtones, it's not quite as accurate. If we look at, for example, zone 8, notice that the mask here is ending on a partially selected white. It's not fully selected and it's not excluded. BlendIf cannot do that. It has to go all the way to the bottom or top. So essentially the BlendIf in this area is going to look more like this, where the whites are excluded. So again, it's not right or wrong. Just be aware of that difference at the extremes of these midtones. If you don't get the result you like with the BlendIf, you might want to try using a traditional mask for a different result. So let's close this out and let's go back in to look at a few other ways we can work with this. So we were looking at the BlendIf under mode. What if instead we look at the BlendIf this mode? And to do that, I've created a red gradient to give us a little bit more complexity, because with a solid red layer, there's really nothing to the current layer but one pixel value. In this case, we now have a gradient going from bright red on the top to dark red at the bottom. And we still have our underlying gradient going from black on the left to white on the right. So if we go and look at BlendIf under, if I start clicking through the zones, we're still moving left to right because everything is based on this underlying layer. Now the mask may look a little bit weird as we started to blend a gradient, but if we look at our visualization, we see that, yep, everything is completely the same up and down It's only a horizontal difference because the underlying layer only changes horizontally. Let's switch over to this mode, which on CS6 you would do by holding down Shift and Command or Shift and Control on a PC. And if we start clicking through the different options here, notice Zone 2, Zone 3, we're now moving up and down the image instead of left and right because we're doing this based on the values of this layer. Or looking at the BlendIf, we're now using the top slide of this BlendIf, this layer on the top. So it has a different result. If we were to work with the bottom sliders, we'd be moving with that underlying layer. But we can also do a visualization on this to help understand what's going on. So let's look at, for example, Zone 2 on this layer, which looks like it's strongest right about here. If we click If, notice that the visualization in the BlendIf this mode is different. It's not possible to use the same visualization for both, but it is possible to visualize. So we can see that this is our Zone 2 selection here. Now you may be wondering why it looks so much wider in here, and that's simply because this goes from black to white. This gradient is much more of a mid-tone gradient, so that's why you see a little bit wider spread here. But again, we can click the If visualization to turn it on and off, and we'll see that green visualization. The one thing to be aware of is if we create this visualization and then we start to click to other different blend modes, we're not actually changing our preview. We have to destroy and recreate it, and now we have an accurate preview because it's creating a static layer to do the BlendIf this. That's just one limitation of the visualization, but just simply double click on it to get that visualization if you need to make any changes and look at some other area to get the accurate preview there. So that's the BlendIf functionality in Lumenzia for the general masks. But what about these zone and range pickers? So let's first just kind of clear things here. And let's look at if we wanted to select vertically this area here. So based on the underlying gradient, we can switch over to BlendIf under. Then we'll click on our picker, which is automatically showing us the underlying layers. Click on the tone we want, hit OK, and there we go. We've got the BlendIf based on that area. Or we can go back and perhaps some other tonal ranges of interest to us. So a very powerful way to pick. You can do these narrow zones or you can do the wide zones using the top picker and select whatever you want from the image. Or we could do the range picker. Click on that and we're going to have to pick two tones. So I want to go from maybe here, click OK, up to maybe here and click OK. And we've now selected that range. Or we could click again and pick another range, maybe from here, I'm going to hit enter, to here and hit enter. We've selected this range. We can also get some more advanced options. If we hold down the control key when we click on range, we'll see that we have some additional options here. So we can determine if the range is going to have more or less feathering or be inverted. Which you can also get by clicking the Not button up here, but for CS6 users, you need to have access within the panel here, just given the complexity of what's going on. So let's pick the narrow, click OK, and I'll pick from here to here, and we can see that the fall off is much tighter. So just like with the regular Lumenzia range tool, we can determine whether the range tool is going to have a lot of feathering or not much at all using those different options.